Okay. Okay. Good morning. So, what I want to look at today is something. I hope it pans out the way I'd like it to pan out, because what I want to look at is a very strange halacha. We all know it. So the Torah says the Torah's got at the end, towards the end of Teizei, it's got a whole lot of different discussions about there's if different types of relationships that happen, but at the end it speaks about all certain forbidden relationships. So, for example, it says lo yikach ish et eshet aviv v'lo yigale knaf aviv. You're not allowed to marry your father's ex-wife. V'lo yavo b'tzuadaka v'chol shuvcha b'kal Hashem. Somebody who's had some type of damage to their organs is not allowed to come into the congregation of Hashem. And then it says this one, which is always, I don't know if it's bothered me, but it's always interested me. This concept, lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem, that a mamzer is not allowed to come into the Kahal Hashem, into the congregation of the Jewish people. Gamdor Asiri, even to the 10th generation, lo yavo lo b'kal Hashem, is not allowed to come into the Kahal Hashem. So it mentions Kahal Hashem twice, and it calls this person a mamzer. Now, it's the question is, what is a mamzer? We're not talking about a person who, we call our colloquial mamzer. We're talking about a real mamzer. Let's try and understand what that means. So the first thing we would do usually would go into Rashi and to try and understand what the mamzer is, because the word mamzer is not a word. It's not a word that we know about. It's the first time and the only time it's really mentioned. So you look at Rashi. Rashi is lo yavo mamzer b'kahal Hashem, that a mamzer shouldn't come into the Kahal Hashem, into the congregation of the Jewish people. And Rashi says lo yisa Yisraelit. He's not allowed to marry a Yisraelit, a Jewish woman, and that's it. It doesn't explain what it is. So what is this mamzer? Where does it come from? What is the name mamzer? How does it pan out? So in order to understand that, let's look at different spaces, different understandings, if we can, just to try and get the basics. The Malbim, as well as others, begin to explain what the mamzer is. That it comes from the word mumzar. What mumzar? It's that there's a mum, there's a blemish, a strange blemish. The strange blemish. Why is that? So if you look at Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, he explains the whole thing quite effectively. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that the lo yavo b'tzuadaka, the person who's got damaged sexual organs, is not allowed into the Kahal Hashem, and how that works and what that is. I'm not going into the detail of that right now, but he says the two of them, that one and the mamzer, both come together to a certain degree. And why is that? And he says, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the beauty of Hirsch is that he sets up foundations for us to understand. And he says the following. He said, both of these are not allowed into Kahal Hashem. And that therefore is the key to our trying and understanding this. He says the whole point here is lahagdain al Kahal Hashem. It's to protect the Kahal Hashem, to protect this congregation of the Jewish people, which is what? Techum anisuim hayehudi. It's coming to protect the foundations of the concept of Jewish marriage. Because the concept of Jewish marriage is not just for some type of physical relationships, but the concept of Jewish marriage is rather to develop a system and a foundation for the Jewish home, and for that to go further. So therefore, if in this case, or whatever Petzua Daka is, and whatever these things are, that since it's going to only be a physical relationship without any real toilet, and you know that from before, without any real benefit going further. So then, if that's the case, it doesn't fit into the foundations of what a Jewish marriage should be. And therefore, he says the following in terms of the mamzer, that the mamzer, we understand, where does a mamzer come from? What is the avera that creates the mamzer itself. So he says, if we look carefully, what the value is very simple. It's where a relationship between a man and a woman who in halakha, that relationship, what we call it kiddushin, cannot be toifes. Kiddushin is that process of marriage. We know it's the first part of the marriage ceremony, and it cannot be toifes. It cannot fix itself. So there's certain relationships where they cannot come together, which we all know what those relationships are. But for example, a man who is a woman who's married to another man cannot have a relationship with man A, cannot have a relationship with man B, because in that case, Kiddushin is not Toifes. What that means is that there cannot be a space of Kedusha in their relationship, even though they might have the most wonderful relationship as such, in terms of their human relationship. It's not a relationship that sits in the Torah, and not a relationship that sits in the Torah. It's not a relationship that allows for Kedusha. And since it doesn't allow for Kedusha, it doesn't fit within the Kahal Hashem, because the Kahal Hashem demands a space of deep Kedusha. And so therefore, it doesn't work. So, but then says Rav Shimshon Falosh, we need to understand where the word mamzer comes from, because the word mamzer is a very difficult word. It's nowhere else, and he goes through different spaces to try and understand. And he says Yitachen the word mamzer is from mi mazar, which is, he says, is karov le masar. Well, masar is like musar. He says, or masira, or passing on to the next. He says, mi mazar, meaning that this is the person who is unable to pass on the next generation of kedusha to its children, and therefore he says that he says all he can pass on is that which he has. It's a very difficult concept to understand, because he didn't do anything wrong. He's just he or she is just the result of a relationship, of a forbidden relationship. So what did they do? So he says here, in actual fact, the word he wants to explain, says Rav Shimshon Falosh, is that it indicates, the concept of mamzer indicates that the entire relationship was focused only on a physical thing. There was no, as he says, musari. There was nothing. There was no wider or deeper concept in the relationship, which is not a relationship in Torah. A relationship in Torah is a relationship which needs to be both physical, but more importantly, in a way, the physical needs to be born out of the actual spiritual, emotional connection that is in the relationship. Whereas in the relationship that exists in this forbidden relationship, it's mainly driven by the physicality, in which he wants to explain. And so therefore he says that this who yalid mizraot who omeid benigud la Torah, it comes completely against everything that the Torah stands for. And that's why he says mamzer hu shem urkav mumzar. It's a name which comes from this mumzar, which we said earlier on. Hamum shala mamzer. What is the mum? What is the blemish of the mamzer? Hu zar va'ein lo kol makom al admat Torah. Is that he's always going to be a stranger. He's always going to be someone who's not allowed into admat Torah, the grounding of the Torah. It's a very difficult thing, because he says nimtza shemamzer einenu kinui ishi hamoreh al kesher hamamzer lehorav. It's not going back to his parents. Elohim saying et etzema ibura asu hu mityaches hein lezachar hein lenakeva. He says that it doesn't indicate anything about the relationship that the parents had as such, but rather say there's something in the very essence of this person who has come, could be the most wonderful person in the world, who has come out of that. There's something lacking in them. And the Gemara tells us that a Talmud Chacham who is a mamzer gets precedence over the Kohen Gadol. So it's not an issue in the in the person as a human being, but something about them not being able to come into the Jewish people themselves, which is a very difficult thing. But what does become important, and this is really what struck it with me, is there was a story that happened in Cape Town, is that we know that a mamzer is not allowed to marry a Jew, and if that's the case, there was a big machlokas between Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Henkin in America regarding reform and conservative weddings, because we know that when a person gets divorced, so then they have to have a get, and if you don't have a get, then it's still considered to be divorced. And therefore, if there would be a relationship with a woman who didn't get a divorce, didn't get a get, so then it would be an adulterous relationship, and the result would be a mamzer. So their whole discussion was a reform and conservative kiddushin, in inverted commas, considered to be a marriage? And there's a big machlokas, yes or no, and why not? But we don't have to go into that. But what came out of it is that there was a proliferation of potential mamzerim, because in the event of there being a divorce without a get, so then all of a sudden everybody's remarrying, and according to the basics of, let's say, reform, there's no get required, a get as we understand in halacha, and therefore the children are mamzerim. And we had a case in Cape Town where there was a what we call a safek mamzer. They weren't sure, and there's a man named Rabbi Ram, who was the Rosh, he came as the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva of Cape Town, and he arrived, and it was an older man, didn't really fit in with the bochrim, whatever the case was, and there was it was difficult for him to really find his space. However, he was asked the shaila. He's a massive Talmid Chacham, and he was asked the shaila to try and find a way of being matir this mamzer, of finding a way that this mamzer wasn't no longer mamzer. So remember, we said the way the Rambam presents it is that if you have a safek, the Rambam says that a safek mamzer, shesafek mamzer mutar lavo b'kal, that if it's a safek, if it's a doubt that they really are, they're not, or they aren't, so then they're allowed to marry in. And so what he had to try and find was a way of finding the safek that this child was actually possibly a mamzer, possibly not. And he said that this was, he spent 2 years in Cape Town, and he said for the only reason he managed to find it was a massive thing that Ravadia Yosef wrote to him. The big shkoyach was an amazing thing, that the only thing that he was in Cape Town for was to allow this couple to get married, because he was able to find the suffix of the mamzeret. And it's something that is so something that's hard for us to understand, and I know they haven't given a full picture of it, but hard to us to understand why this person who is just the product of this adulterous relationship or inappropriate relationship is no longer is not able to enter into the Jewish people, because he or she did nothing wrong. But it's clear from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch that the reason is because there's something in the essence of that parental relationship that lacks a certain amount of kiddushin, of kedusha, of sanctity, and since it lacks that kedusha, therefore this child's relationship, even with a fully fledged Jew who wasn't born in such a strange way, even with that, nonetheless, that is unable to be completely tofes, the kedusha is not completely able to connect together. Why not? Don't really understand. But I just thought I would share that with you as just some interesting things to start thinking about, is how we understand this concept of the mamzer and where it fits. Have a beautiful day, everybody. I know it wasn't completely expansive,